We have a wonderful program today, and one of the gentlemen who's responsible for bringing us Pope Francis, Cardinal George, who's a member of the conclave. He doesn't need much of an introduction, but I'll give one anyway. He's the first Archbishop of Chicago to be a native of Chicago. What parish is it? Hope of Christian School in St. Pascal's. Okay. And
the west side of the Christian School closed now. I closed the parish I was baptized in.
Oh,
but I grew up at St. Pascal's.
Great. Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago since 1997, previously Bishop of Yakima in Washington and Portland in Oregon, and a member of various prominent positions in the Vatican. Previously also the president of the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference. He has an MA in philosophy from Catholic University, an MA in theology from the University of Ottawa, and a PhD in American philosophy from Tulane University, and is the author of a couple recent books, The Difference God Makes and God in Action, both published within the last 5 years. That's all of the credential stuff, but let me just say that Cardinal George has also been a consistent supporter of the Center for World Catholicism at DePaul since its inception 6 years ago. He's been to many of our events and has been very supportive, and thank him for that. And also, Cardinal George met for about an hour with a class full of freshmen who were just coming into DePaul last September. I was teaching a Discover Chicago class, and we just contacted Cardinal George, and he very graciously agreed to sit with our students for an hour, our freshmen, and chat. And it was a really important experience for them. The students talked about it afterwards, and not only did they meet the most famous person they'd ever met, but they all remarked on Cardinal George's accessibility and good humor and humility, all of which are characteristics that we've come to associate with our Pope Francis as well. So please welcome our Cardinal Francis.
Thank you very much. DePaul undergraduates live very sheltered lives before they come, so whoever they meet is a famous person. But I'm grateful to all of you for being part of this conference, and grateful to the university and to Father Hochschneider for beginning this initiative some years ago, and before that also for beginning the Catholic Studies program at DePaul, which has done a lot to reposition, I think, the study of the Catholic faith within DePaul University's programs. And the role that I agreed to play this morning was just to say a few words about the circumstances of the Pope's election and the way in which he's followed the program that was anticipated and the way in which he surprised us by not doing so. And both of them are important. A year ago, when we went into the conclave, because Benedict XVI had resigned the papal office, which was an extraordinary event indicating his own freedom, but the reason he gave for that resignation was the strain on himself, to the point that he felt he couldn't really do the office what it deserved, what it needed to be done for the sake of the Church. He resigned for love of the Church, basically, that he felt he was no longer able to uphold the office as it should be. Part of that was his own health, and he had warned us about that before the election 8 years ago, 9 years ago now. The heart trouble that is chronic to him was already known. He didn't like to fly for that reason. And also his personality was very different from that of Pope John Paul II, and he pointed that out. That is, he's a scholar. He spent all his life in a classroom and in libraries. Before he was made the Archbishop of Munich, for 4 years he governed a local church, and that was not an easy experience for him. And then he returned basically to his scholarly pursuits as head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, did a wonderful job there, and was, of course, as we all know, someone who helped Pope John Paul II, who was more trained in philosophy than in theology, to create a magisterium that incorporated contemporary philosophical concerns, particularly subjectivity from the phenomenological school, into Thomism and the more classical theological way of expressing the faith. The magisterium of John Paul II is quite original in many ways. People think of him as a traditionalist, which he is, but it's a tradition that is alive, and the future generations will try to sort it out in ways that will show just how original his mind truly was. But part of that program was, of course, the work of Benedict XVI, so immersed in the fathers of the church and in the theological tradition, as we know. And so when the Cardinals met in the grief at the death of a truly monumental figure of John Paul II, the concern was to continue the legacy in some fashion. And the obvious person who could do that was Joseph Ratzinger, who was part of shaping that legacy. And he himself was, of course, totally different from John Paul II, who was an extrovert and who took energy from people. He would enter a room rather tired, and he would leave the room energized, especially in the encounter with young people. He had people at his daily mass in the palace, unlike the present Pope in Doma Santi Marti, but he always had people at every meal, practically. And he was a great listener. He would listen and listen and listen. And most of all, at the end, you would see the form of humor that was basically ironic. He would make fun of himself so that he was free to make fun of you. And it was a wonderful experience to be a bishop under John Paul II. So it was kind of a will, a desire that that be continued, and Benedict was elected and did a wonderful job in many ways, contributing in his own way to the magisterium. He wrote things, as you know, that we'll be reading hundreds of years from now, probably in the second lesson of the Breviary readings office. But when he resigned, there was a clear sense among the cardinals that we needed somebody not to continue but to change. There was a concern to change so that the governance that was never one of Benedict's strong points would be more assured, particularly the reform of the Curia. We knew that things weren't working well because when the Curia doesn't work well, then we can't work well as bishops of local churches. It doesn't mesh the way it should. And the curial cardinals were the most critical of the way the Curia was operating. So the governance issue was before us very clearly. And I think that's what I went with others to Rome as we prepared to elect a successor to Pope Benedict XVI. And also in my own mind, an interview with the New York Times at the time, I said there are two things we look for: someone who knows how to govern and someone who has a heart for the poor. Because the poor are the first in the kingdom of heaven, and we all ride into the kingdom of God and holding the hands of poor people, or we don't get there at all. And so we wanted someone who was also young enough to have the strength to go forward. And that's why in the beginning, Cardinal Bergoglio was not a candidate really in a realistic way, because we were looking for somebody younger in the beginning who would have the good health to pick up the work that had faltered somewhat in the declining years of Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict's health is much improved. I remember talking to Archbishop Genschwein, his secretary, about a week after he had resigned and gone to Castel Gandolfo, and I asked Archbishop Genschwein how Pope Benedict was doing, and he said mostly he sleeps. So I think he's much more restored now. People who have seen him, I haven't, have said that he is himself again. But obviously he was worn down, and so we were looking for someone who was younger. Before the conclave begins, as you know, there are 2 weeks when all the cardinals, the electors under 80, the people who are over 80, get together every morning in the Synod Hall of the Paul VI Auditorium and speak. You can speak about anything you want to speak about. Mostly they talk about issues before the church, or they'll talk about the conditions of their local church, or they'll talk about what kind of pope we should have. And you get to speak for a number of minutes, and there's no exactly give and take. You speak in the order in which you ask to speak, and so you don't have somebody speaking to what somebody said just before. It's an odd conversation. The synods have that drawback as well. Nonetheless, everybody gets to speak if you want to, and most do. In that conversation, in the mornings, people begin to define what the church needs, but also to some extent they define themselves. The Cardinals are a group from around the world, as you know, and we get to know each other sometimes at meetings, sometimes in other ways as well. But we're all acquainted, but not necessarily all deeply cognizant of each other or friends. And so those conversations are interesting, and in them, as has been reported, the present Pope gave a very moving intervention about not being a self-referential church. It is a church that speaks more about the church herself than about Christ her Lord. And so that again brought Cardinal Bergoglio back to the forefront of people's minds, and that helped to identify him to some extent as someone who could be the sort of missionary pope again that we felt that we needed. In the afternoons there are no meetings, but the cardinals meet one another, or they don't, as they wish, over coffee or at supper, 2 or 3 or 4 at a time. At that point, it's not so much issues that are discussed as candidates. That's when you ask about people. You know Cardinal so-and-so, I don't. What do you think of him? Could he be Pope? And so that's all part of the discernment. In the evening, pretty much you're to yourself, and that's where you bring that in prayer before the Lord, because the conclave is to be an exercise in discernment, which means you have to be free to discern what God wants and not what your own interests might lead you to choose. And it's very difficult to, as you know, if you've been involved in those processes of discernment, to achieve the inner freedom necessary to say, well, all right, I'm not going to vote for anybody for any motive except, is he the best candidate that I can think of to fill the papal office? Not is he my friend, not does he know my language, not is he going to be understanding of my own situation, nothing except who can be the universal pastor of the Catholic Church. It's the only motive that is morally correct as you go into that conclave itself. And that takes some time, because we all come with our own interests, which are good interests, the interests of our people, and other interests, perhaps, if they're not sinful, nonetheless are not bad. And so to examine yourself in that way takes some time, and it also brings into question about the freedom of the candidate. That is, if I have to be free to vote for someone who will be the Pope, then I have to ask if he is free to accept the office and to exercise it well. And so that too, there are extrinsic concerns that might hinder a very, very fine candidate from in fact being effective as Pope. What country does he come from? What is his family like? What is he going to bring? Those extrinsic concerns have to be considered because extrinsic to the person, because they do influence people's understanding of who the Pope is and therefore what the office can do. And so it's exercising freedom as discernment is supposed to be. Am I free of any interest except what I'm there for? And is the person whom I'm thinking about free to exercise the office? In the conclave itself, there are no discussions. People seem to think that because it's an election, it's kind of a political gathering, and so people get up and say, vote for so-and-so or don't vote for me. There's none of that at all. It's a liturgy. You're in a liturgical dress. You're in the red robes of a cardinal at that Mass. And so you pray, and then occasionally you pray in Latin, and you're instructed lightly in Italian, and then you vote. And after you pray and you vote, you pray and you vote. You can speak quietly to the people next to you if you like, but the people next to you are always the same people, because you're seated in honor, in order precedence. So, and my left was always the Archbishop of Mexico City. Next to him was the Archbishop of Vienna, Schönbrunn. And my right was the Archbishop of Lisieux for the Latins until he died. He was a philosopher, and we used to be French. But he's taken by Cardinal Borcheleschi now, who's the prefect of the Congregation for Education. So you can talk, and you do, but basically you vote and you pray. Pray to yourself, sometimes read, say the rosary, because it takes a long time to vote. If you want to see what the voting process is, you can look it up in the Vatican website. It's a very involved process. They've been at this a long time. And so you take an oath, which is very, very solemn, that you'll not have any motive in voting for someone except who is best suited for the office. So that dominates the whole proceedings. And it's in a place, as you know, that has the creation of the world on the ceiling by the young Michelangelo, and the end of the world on the wall by the old Michelangelo. And so here you are in the history of the salvation of the world at a certain moment making a very, very important choice, and you have to answer to Christ, who is your judge, and you say that in the oath. I swear before Christ, who is my judge, and he's right there on the wall in front of you, and I'm voting for the one whom I believe to be best suited. So it was an act of discernment, and I firmly believe, truly believe, that we have the Pope that the Holy Spirit wants us to have. The Spirit is the spirit of surprises, and so when the election took place, there was no surprise by the time he was elected, but the name was certainly a surprise. And that, from the very beginning, I think, shows a certain freedom that is so attractive about the Pope. He's in a tradition-bound office, and the traditions unite us to Christ. There's a reason for them. Yet within them, he's free. And I think that's probably more than anything else what has captured the imagination of the world. You don't expect a man in that office to be as free as this man is. And it shows that he's been set free by Christ. It's not a freedom gained by controlling anything. It's a freedom that's a pure gift. And in that, he showed, first of all, his freedom by the choice of the name. It's not a papal name. It's not a Roman name. It's Francis. No one has taken that name. And the name is a program, as we know now. And as he himself said when he took it. So from the beginning, he's shown a certain freedom of a disciple to be truly Pope, fulfill the obligations of the office, but do it in such a way that he does it with a different style, and the style, as I've said, is substance. He is somebody who knows how to govern, although he does it kind of as a religious superior as much as a bishop. That is, there's a certain sort of listening to people and then coming back with a response, whereas bishops have councils and the decisions are often more publicly made than they're made now. But nonetheless, he knows how to govern. What was, and he has certainly a great heart for the poor, what was a surprise to me was the populist approach to his ministry, because that wasn't evident in Buenos Aires. He was a rather dour figure at times there, well respected, and certainly concerned about the poor, but didn't speak to the press, didn't do anything very publicly that would indicate he was going to reach around the heads, over the heads of people who are in charge, generally in order to appeal directly to the people themselves, and do the kind of populist approach to ministry that we now have grown to appreciate. That was a surprise, and it's a good way to solidify his office in such a way that he's then free himself to make the personal and structural changes that will have to be made. The sources of his ministry are not so much of a surprise. That is, there's his own spirituality, which is Ignatian, and therefore gives a larger place to subjectivity than would be the case with other schools of spirituality. There is the use of images for a man who isn't a linguist. That is, he knows how to read all the languages. He's well educated, but he's never had to speak them. And so he speaks Spanish, Argentinian Spanish, and Italian, up to a point. And he's learning, I think, to speak some English now, but he instead speaks through gestures, which are universal. And in his homilies, you can see, too, the way in which he relies upon images rather than concepts. And they're always images of an encounter, and particularly an encounter, first of all, with Christ, but also with those whom Christ most loves. That is, with people at the periphery. As he says, go to the frontier, go to the periphery. There you will meet Christ in the face of the poor. And that encounter with the person is where you start. After that, who is the person? Doctrine tells you that. How should we be his friend? Moral theology tells you that. But you don't start with ideas, you don't start with rules, you start with the relationship of an encounter. And so the images that have so moved the world are universal, and they speak better than any words possibly could. Also, which I wasn't so much aware of, is that his ministry is primarily concerned to make conscious to us the perpetual presence of God's mercy. I know others have spoken to you about that, because he himself made reference to John Paul II's institution of the Mercy Sunday devotion, and also to his encyclical on Divus and Misericordia. There, John Paul II defines mercy as love which is eager to forgive. So you start always with forgiveness. You start always with mercy, no matter whom you're talking to or in what circumstances you find yourself. That too comes out of his spirituality. As you know, when he was 17 years old, he went to make an ordinary confession. And instead of just going through the list of sins and receiving absolution, he said, somebody welcomed me. There was a presence. There was someone waiting for me. And that has so touched him that he knows that God is always waiting for us. And therefore we can count on that mercy always, no matter what else there is. That can be misunderstood, because it's one thing to count on God's mercy because you're asking for forgiveness, and if God has forgiven you, who am I to judge? That's just fine. It's another thing to not ask for forgiveness, but rather to demand approval for what you do. And that is not what the Pope is concerned about. He's not saying we should approve sinners and leave them in their sin, because nobody can judge anything. He's saying that when someone is conscious of their sin and asks for forgiveness, well, then you leave the judgment to God. It's a very different approach, asking for forgiveness or demanding approval. Pope is here. And there can be misunderstandings, as there have been, around that. And there, too, there are certain dangers in the rather image-prone ministry, that expectations that are raised by it, because images can be interpreted in different ways, will not be met at a certain point. And when that happens, there could be some disillusionment and some difficulties as the church goes on. Nonetheless, it's very clear that the experience of God's mercy, the use of images, his own spirituality from the Ignatian exercises are where he is coming from, along with the Aparecida document, which I know you discussed too, where the church is supposed to be a church of missionary disciples, unlike the way we look at the church in this country very often as a service provider. Sometimes the services are sacraments, but that's our problem. But the good services would be the approval of our education, healthcare, etc., etc. That's what the church is, a philanthropic organization for providing social services. And he isn't interested in that. I mean, he's interested in encountering people. If you can use the service to encounter people and know them by name and know their faces, that's fine. But if you can't, then you just become an NGO. And that's not the kind of church he wants. He wants a church of missionary disciples. And that is a challenge to us in a highly institutionalized church, which created our institutions precisely because we wanted to be ourselves in a rather hostile environment 100 years ago, which is becoming hostile again. Then we have to, I think, ask to what extent have we lost ourselves in ministry and forgotten mission. In other words, what we do is how we define ourselves rather than why we do it, the purpose, which is the mission of the church, to introduce the world to its Savior until he returns again in glory. And that is the last point I'd make. In the Aparecida document, we're defined as the church of missionary disciples, and that is the church. The world is always contingent. The world passes away. That too is part of his consciousness, I think. I was quite surprised when we made reference more than once to Robert Hugh Benson's book, Lord of the World. I read that when I was in high school. It was written in 1905. And it foresees air travel, it foresees all kinds of things, but it's a picture of the end of the world when a very charismatic American senator becomes, in fact, the master of the world, the Lord of the world, and he turns out to be the Antichrist. That vision of a world that is contingent, and therefore we shouldn't get so preoccupied by it that we forget that it's the mission that is primary, and the mission defines creation rather than the world defining the church. That is part of his self-understanding of what the papal office brings to the world also. That isn't so clear at times, but it's clear when you get to know him a little bit. So that is what I wanted to say about the evangelization that is ours now. He's picked up the new evangelization that was first proclaimed by the Council itself, in some ways without using the term, and then clearly by John Paul II and continued by Benedict. He's picked that up, but with the emphases that I've mentioned, out of his own spirituality, out of the way in which he approaches things, and those insights and those approaches will be constant no matter what else he says and does. We'll see how that works itself out in the context of the synod that's called For the Family. That will be the first test, in a way, of a possible disillusionment that I spoke of. That is, when the synod of the family, the second one also, Virgins Preparatory, is said and done, the family, which is so important to the church and to the world, is the basic social unit, and it appears again and again in his preaching. When that is reworked along with the themes that I've mentioned, then I think we'll have a better sense of how much impact he will have on a world that has defined families in ways that are antithetical to divine revelation. So I thank you for your attention, and I think we have a minute or two if you want to ask a question. Right?
Yes. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule, Cardinal George.
Sure.
Cardinal George has several other obligations this morning, so we don't have a whole lot of time for questions, but if there's one or two questions that people would like to ask, please.
Cardinal, if you could project 3 years hence, let's say you're in retirement, probably teaching it.
Or dead.
And a successor is here. What will the people in ministry, priests, religious, lay people, will they notice any difference from this Pope, do you think?
Yes, whether I'm here or a successor or what is here, I think certainly they would notice any difference in what? You mean in the way?
Well, there's a lot of enthusiasm about this man, a lot of expectations of a general nature, of change and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
My suspicion is that 3 years hence, things in the Archdiocese of Chicago, for example, will look about the same they do today. So I guess my question goes to this: how much can a pope do, and what form would it take? Forgetting the average person in the parish, people in ministry, how might they be different? What might they? How may see things differently? Or is this going to take a much longer time? Is it going to be confined pretty much to what's going on at the Vatican IV?
Well, I can't, know for sure what things might look like here or anywhere else in 3 years' time. But there are long-term trends that are with us in the culture and in the church. And then there are emphases and style and the way that I've said that the Pope will bring to the fore. It does make a difference who is Pope. It made a difference under Paul VI and his emphasis on picking up the Council's emphasis on dialogue as the way to approach the world, and his great encyclical, Ecclesiam Suam. That defined the ministry of the Church for the last 50 years, basically. It made a difference, because John Paul II was Pope, because Benedict was Pope. So it makes a difference who is Pope. And the kind of approaches that the present Pope has will, I hope, permeate throughout our entire ministry. But here, at least, and I think, well, no, it's very different in Africa and Asia. We are, to some extent, in a period of institutional decline. We've been that way, not just the Catholic Church, but all institutions are in some form of decline. So in that kind of situation, when you have institutional decline, you save the structures you need for the mission, but most of all, you emphasize people. So I have tried to revise the seminary program, revise the deacon preparation program, revise the catechetical program, revise the ecclesial ministry program, try to, and use the councils in such a way that the people form each other. And I have 11 councils, and they work well. So if you've got people who are well-formed, and will be well-formed in the vision that President Pope has brought to us now, then it won't, that will be a difference. Less perhaps emphasis upon the church as a service organization, and a lot more emphasis upon the church as a missionary corps that doesn't exist for itself, but exists for the salvation of the world. The Pope spoke about the danger of a self-referential church. Well, if your institution isn't so strong, it's harder to be self-referential. The great irony would be if we had a self-referential papacy, where the people talk more about the Pope than they talked about Christ. That's something that the Pope certainly would not want. So we'll see. The test will be in 3 years if we're all talking more about Christ than we are about either the Pope or the Church. And I think we will do that because as I look at the people who have been formed in the reform programs that we put into place in the last 10 or 11 years, precisely to try to strengthen people as the institutions are weakened, then it'll be fine. If you've got the right people, the institution can come and go. The people will know what to do.
Thank you, Cardinal George. My question regards the upcoming synod. next fall. I have the impression, just from reading journalistic reports, that the rules of the Synod have been changed. We know that this survey was sent out that Catholics in parishes around the world could respond to on a variety of issues regarding family life and sexuality. What has been changed about the way this Synod is being prepared for, and your thoughts on that?
Well, the internal rules of the Synod haven't been changed yet. They were changed under Benedict, who enjoyed intellectual conversation where ideas were joined. And so he put an hour at the end of the day's discussion for people to talk to one another outside of that framework of every 6 minutes and the speaker comes along, which is somewhat deadly. The ideas surface, but they're not joined. He put in that hour in the internal conversation in the Synod where people could talk to one another about what they had said. Whether that hour will be extended, which would be helpful perhaps, if you do that, then you cut down on the time, and everybody might not have a chance to speak. The internal rules, therefore, are still what they were. The preparation is different in as much as the Pope sits in on the Council for the Synod almost the entire meeting when they do meet. That's new, and he does it because he wants to see that the Synod is going to be a more important instance of governance than it has been in the past. So it shows his concern, and it also means that people take more seriously, I think, what they do say within the Council of the Synod. So that's different in preparing for the next Synod. What's also different, as you mentioned, was the attempt to ask what others have experienced in trying to live the doctrine of the Church. In other words, it isn't as if he was putting out the doctrines of the Church that are now going to be subject to popular opinion. That isn't the way the Church governs herself, because she believes that her doctrines have come from God and from revelation, interpreted, but nonetheless from revelation and not just from popular opinion. It's why the Church calls us to conversion and not simply rubber stamps whatever comes down the road. We're not chaplains to the status quo at any time in history. So the idea is very good, but it didn't work very well. Only about 75 people responded in Chicago. I used the regular system of going to the councils and going to the seminary faculty to respond to that questionnaire. The reason was the questionnaire was so written that I had a hard time responding to it, and I'm aware of all the documents they're talking about. And I talked to people who tried, and they gave up. So it was a good lesson. I think the new head of the synodal office was coming in and didn't perhaps recognize the difficulty of a sondage, an opinion poll that's universal, and that if you're going to make a friendly kind of questionnaire, you have to spend a lot more time working through that. It's very hard to do that when you're talking about the whole world, different cultures, because in Rome you don't expect them to read through everything. They want to get responses to the questions they've asked. If you respond to something else, they don't pay attention to it. They can't. It would be the work of a century to try to sort that out, like, you know, correcting term papers from 1 billion and 200 million people. You can't do that. So you have to respond to the questions they ask, and that's what they insisted. But the questions were not user-friendly, and so they've learned something, I think, from that. It's a good idea to do that, but it has to be done in a different way. And they got a chance to do it now, because at the end of the first Synod, you got a year before they call the second Synod on the same topic. And so if they do it right, and commit us to use the monkey survey and all that stuff, we can get some good responses. We didn't get this.
Please join me in thanking Cardinal.